Joining me now is conservative attorney George Conway. He is a contributor to The Atlantic and co-host of the podcast George Conway Explains It All. So I want to dig into all of that, the timing of the Supreme Court, because a lot of us can't figure that out. But we were just talking about the ruling today, and you tweeted today, it doesn't even profess to be interpreting the text.
It doesn't. And I think that's, Professor Eiffel said that there was a lot of overreach in the majority opinion. I think the problem here is that all 9 justices underreached. They simply decided that they weren't going to apply the Constitution the way you normally apply it, which is you read the text and you try to figure out what it means in the context of the history, and you apply it. And the plain text of the constitutional provision here says that Donald Trump is disqualified. And so that was the real problem with today's decision. And I don't think I don't make much of the concurring opinions criticism of the majority for having gone too far, because at the end of the day, I can't see where in the majority opinion it does more than say that states can't enforce Section 3 of the 14th Amendment against federal office holders. And, the only difference I can see between that holding and what the 4 concurring justices, the 4 women, interestingly, said was that they probably would have restricted it to the president and just the president. But again, there's just no basis, no textual basis, no historical basis
for them
in the
not
14th
to
Amendment
apply.
not to apply it. And the only argument that ever is made in any of the opinions as to why you would restrict states from applying the 14th Amendment, the plain text of the 14th Amendment, the 14th Amendment that contains all sorts of other provisions that apply regardless of whether Congress says, whatever Congress says, including the Equal Protection Clause, which prohibits race discrimination. The fact of the matter is that there's no basis to single out Section 3 as being different from these other provisions. And they're just making it up. And all the justices were making it up.
Why, though? Why? You've studied this court for so long.
Because they were terrified.
Of what? Trump? The reaction?
The reaction. And I think that's clear from Justice Barrett's concurring opinion. I mean, she says all of this stuff she says the quiet part out loud. This is not the time to amplify disagreement with stridency. The court has settled a politically charged case in the volatile season of a presidential election. Particularly in this circumstance, writings of the court should turn the national temperature down, not up. She's terrified. And they all were terrified, including the liberal judges. Okay, the only difference that I can see between what the liberal judges said and what the majority said was they probably would have restricted it to the president. But if they do that, the opinion would have been even worse, because at least it would have been looked like you just cherry picked the president out of a pile to say that the presidency is somehow special from all these other.
And there were other insurrectionists too.
And there are other insurrectionists. I mean, look, the bottom line is they were never ever going to rule against Trump here, and not because it was Donald Trump, but because of the that this court, with only a limited amount of political capital these days, and we probably disagree on the reasons for that, but we agree and disagree on some of it, but they don't have the political capital to all of a sudden drop this ruling on the public and say Donald Trump can't appear on the ballot. And they were terrified of it.
But why should they have to worry about political capital? They're the highest court in the land.
They are the highest court in the land, but they are worried about political capital. I mean, this is a court that basically, and you're going to disagree with some of what I'm about to say and agree with someone, that has basically wasted its political capital on things it should have never been involved in. It should have never been involved in abortion, for example. You'll disagree on that, but I say that it was a mistake to get involved the way they did, and even Ruth Bader Ginsburg kind of agrees with me on that. And it was a mistake to get out of it after 50 years, after telling hundreds of millions of women that they have this right. And so they've blown a lot of capital on things that really they shouldn't have been concerned with because it's not in the Constitution. This provision, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, actually is in the Constitution, and it's clear. And they didn't have to make anything up to apply it. The only rationale that they had for not applying it is to say that, oh, well, you'll get this patchwork. Some states will rule this way. Some states will rule that way. Some states will use different records. Some states will use different procedures. But that shouldn't be the court's problem. That should be the insurrectionist's problem. And this guy, and as you point out, the major takeaway from this case is that Donald Trump remains, because there's nothing in any of these opinions that says otherwise.
What they didn't say.
An adjudicated insurrectionist. He's still that, just as he's already an adjudicated rapist.
George Conway, I love your passion. I love your breakdown and your legal mind. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. I appreciate it. I've spent all day wondering what Sharolyn Ifill thinks about all of this. She never holds back. She has lots of brilliant thoughts. She's the former president of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. She's now the Vernon Jordan Distinguished Professor in Civil Rights at Howard Law School. And you've said, we've talked about this case before. You've said, quote, Section 3 was enacted for such a time as this and for such a figure as President Trump. And you've reflected on history, which is so powerful. What was your reaction to the court decision today?
Well, I wasn't surprised, Jen, at the outcome, at the judgment, that we had talked about this before, as you said at the top of the hour, that the court would be looking for an off-ramp. I was extremely disappointed in the oral argument, in part because many of the justices seem unprepared. This was a case in which there were many amicus briefs that were filed. There were complicated arguments. This was a case in which we don't have a lot to go on in terms of precedent, because fortunately, until 2020, we had not experienced a federal insurrection. So I expected that the court was going to seek an off-ramp, and I thought the off-ramp would be kind of what it was, which is that they were not going to allow one state to remove Trump from the ballot. I think what is disturbing is the overreach. And here I'm going to have to disagree with you a little bit. I hesitate to do so because we're in sync with the Green.
You're a legal expert. I welcome your disagreement, please.
Well, I think I even disagree with other legal experts on this. I am not at all encouraged by the fact that the court did not say something about whether or not Trump, in fact, engaged in insurrection. It was very clear from the argument they had no intention of touching it. They had no intention of reviewing the factual premise of the Colorado Supreme Court's decision, and they seemed even disdainful of involving themselves in the stickiness of the actual factual question as to whether or not Trump had participated in insurrection. But what they did do was that they overreached. And even though this was a unanimous judgment, I think the takeaway from this opinion today is the brawl that is clearly happening on this Supreme Court. We have three justices, Justice Sotomayor, Justice Kagan, and Justice Jackson, who seem to be concurring, but it was a pretty harsh concurrence. This is a case, they said, that cried out for judicial restraint, and they used their concurrence to talk about the failure of this court to exercise restraint. Jen, the court went beyond what they needed to do, not only in terms of President Trump, but remember that they also talked about the need for Congress to pass legislation. They described precisely what the congressional action has to be. Then they described the legislation itself, that it has to be tailored to Section 3. And I think this really outraged the three justices who wrote that concurrence. This was not a question that had been factually developed or even legally developed in this case, because it wasn't at issue in this case, but they reached out to do it. And it's kind of, I think, shocking and important for the three concurring justices to say that they did it in order to insulate, they said, this court and the petitioner, that is President Trump, from future controversy. They also said, the three concurring justices, that that the decision today insulates all alleged insurrectionists from future challenges to their holding federal office. And that's important, Jen, because, you know, there were 10 members of Congress, actually one was a representative-elect, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who met with Trump on December 10th. And some of us have been keeping a running list of members of Congress who were involved or believed to have been involved in the plans to overturn the election. Trump is not the only fish in this ocean. And the Supreme Court seemed to go further afield, not only to protect Trump into the future, but also to protect others. And then, of course, there's this concurrence from Amy Coney Barrett, the other conservative on the court, who writes a kind of plaintive, very short concurring opinion, which demonstrates what she clearly had hoped for, was that this court would be unanimous, that the 5 members would restrain themselves from going further than the 3 concurring justices wanted to, and that they could have spoken with one voice in a way that, as she would describe it, would bring the temperature down. And it's clear to me that from her concurrence, she was disappointed that the other five conservative justices, the five male conservative justices, somehow were unable to exercise the restraint that might have resulted in a true unanimous judgment and opinion in this case. I think this is very revealing to us about what's going on that court. I think when the historical record is written, when seats are added to the Supreme Court, as they invariably will be, this will be part of the record of what was happening and what even justices on the court were prepared to say is the overreach of the conservatives on this court. So this is a decision that we expected as it relates to Mr. Trump. Yeah. Its overreach is disturbing as it relates to other insurrectionists and as it relates to the court encroaching on what they believe Congress must do. But also it's very revealing about what is going on this Supreme Court. And it's very contentious.
I mean, when you look at how revealing this is, and please disagree with me anytime, I welcome your viewpoints and also I welcome your brilliance. When you look at that, and we're looking, because we're all waiting, this immunity case, they're not going to start hearing arguments until April. How do you read, we can't predict what they're going to do, but how do you assess or read this ruling today in terms of how they might approach cases related to Trump moving forward?
I'm actually, this is why I'm spending so much time parsing the words of the concurring justices, because I think they're speaking in Morse code to us. I think they are telling us something. And they're telling us something that is very disturbing, which is that, I mean, when they say it is an attempt to insulate all alleged insurrectionists, that's a pretty loaded thing for fellow justices to say on the court, and that the court attempts to insulate itself and the petitioner from further controversy. So I think this idea of reading the tea leaves as though there's any chance that this court is going to rule in a way that does not allow Mr. Trump to go forward, even the immunity case, obviously they could have decided that case on an expedited basis, as they were asked to do by Jack Smith. They didn't do so. They could have left intact the Court of Appeals decision. They didn't do so. They've created a schedule that I think is going to make things very, very difficult. And so I think the idea that the Supreme Court is going to be some form of salvation here is not a sound one. We don't have any reason to believe that. But I do think that we should be independently concerned as a matter of democracy about what is breaking down on the United States Supreme Court, and that their actions would be cast in this way by their three colleagues who were united in that assessment of what's going on, and joined not in that in how far that concurrence went, but joined in the disappointment and dissatisfaction by Amy Coney Barrett, who also clearly would have preferred that the court not engage in this kind of overreach that would set off this kind of fracture. That means that she knows that there are legitimacy issues as well as Americans view what the court is doing. So I think that's, for me, the biggest takeaway from this decision today. And I think it's independently alarming, and we should be paying attention to that as well.
Always read the dissent. That is my shorthand summary, and always watch what the court is doing.
It's a concurrence.
Concurrence, yeah.
It purports to be a concurrence in this case, so you got to read it all.
You got to read it all. Thank you, Sherrilyn Ifill. Always appreciate having you on and talking to you and hearing your brilliance. So I know we've said this before, but I promise you, this week is shaping up to be the biggest one yet for the 2024 presidential race. Here's why. Tomorrow is Super Tuesday, when voters in 16 states will cast their ballots. And while he won't secure the total number of delegates needed tomorrow, the night will likely end with Donald Trump taking an insurmountable lead in the nomination process. Then on Thursday, President Joe Biden gives perhaps his biggest speech of the year in the State of the Union, aside from maybe the convention speech. So this really feels like the kickoff of the general election, when voters will begin to decide between Joe Biden and Donald Trump for president. And at this moment, there are some warning signs for the Biden re-election campaign. There have been recent national polls which have Donald Trump leading, 4 of them, a couple of numbers deeper down that are more problematic. That's all a challenge for the president and his team, no doubt about it. But polls, let's remember, are just a snapshot in time. They're about the moment and a bet on what the electorate will look like. They're worthy of our attention in that respect, but not all of our attention. Because by solely fretting over the polls, we can lose sight of the bigger picture. And that is what is at stake in November. And the contrast between the two candidates voters will have to choose between, that's what it's about. That contrast is stark. On one hand, voters think Joe Biden is old. No argument there. The man is 81. But for those sweating Biden's age and whether he is up to the job, I've got a question for you. What do you think about all this?
Did you just see Maduro, Venezuela? It's unbelievable. Oil exploration and production in the United States. The Biden border will, well, you know this, right? We will expel the warmongers. We are a nation that just recently heard that Saudi Arabia and Russia will repeat your...
I don't even know what that last one said. I mean, you'd rather that guy have access to the nuclear codes? Okay, maybe you're upset about what's happening at the southern border. Absolutely fair. Our country's immigration system is in desperate need of repair, many aspects of it. Something needs to be done. And something would have been done, by the way, had it not been for Donald Trump. When Joe Biden tried to pass a border security package negotiated, by the way, by one of the most conservative Republicans in the Senate, Donald Trump tanked it. He's not the solution, he's kind of the problem. And he killed that bill, not over policy differences, but so he could continue to campaign on an anti-immigrant fear, promising sprawling detainment camps and echoing the language of Adolf Hitler.
Our country is being poisoned. We're really being poisoned. And I will not let him turn the USA into a crime-filled, disease-ridden dumping ground. You know, people with terrible, terrible disease that is easily caught, I have to say, they're pouring into our country.
It's all racism and fear-mongering, all of it. And some money for an effective wall on the side, too, of course. That's it. No real solutions. Okay. Maybe you're upset about Joe Biden's handling of Israel's war in Gaza. I get it. There's no question that more needs to be done to put an end to the humanitarian crisis. More aid, it needs to end. But would you prefer the guy who instituted a Muslim ban? Would you prefer the guy who basically gives Netanyahu completely free rein and otherwise has said next to nothing about this crisis? Seriously, this is about as much as he said.
So you have a war that's going on, and you're probably going to have to let this play out. You're probably going to have to let it play out because a lot of people are dying. It should have never started.
Is that the kind of strategic thinking you're looking for? You're looking for in the Oval Office, in the Situation Room? Okay. Maybe it's the economy you're most concerned about on lots of people's minds. That's understandable. The economy is currently has a 3.7% unemployment rate, 3.1% inflation, with a stock market near record highs. I'm asking this sincerely. Can you articulate one thing, just one, that Donald Trump has done or would do to make the economy better or your life better? Okay, while I'm waiting, let's talk about concerns about corruption that you might be basing your choice on. We've heard a lot about corruption. Despite relentless accusations from Donald Trump and Republicans in Congress, they have come up with nothing, zero, to pin on Joe Biden. It is a fever dream. It's meant to muddy the waters and distract from Donald Trump's 4 criminal indictments, the $500 million he owes for business fraud and sexual assault, and the coup we all watched him attempt in real time. So is this batch of national polls good for Joe Biden? It is not at all. But at this point in the race, I'm not letting them take all of my attention, and neither should Democrats. Joe Biden and Democrats should not be on their heels right now. They can and should play offense on every single issue I just mentioned, not to mention other important issues like reproductive rights and climate change. The policy is on their side. The politics is on their side, and the facts are on their side.